Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. A couple of things I wanted to mention right off the top. I don't think I have explained for a long time what foxing is. The foxed page comes from this idea that when you have a very old, very beloved book, you'll have those little tiny brown speckles that will come on the pages. So the foxed page really speaks to these old and beloved books who really endure. And, you know, we're not always looking at classics here, but in many ways the idea of foxed pages really speaks to the endurance of literature. Which actually brings me to my second point, which is that this is a very difficult and very sad and actually sort of frightening political moment. And it is one of those times where I can't decide if I really want to escape into literature or if I really want to use literature as a way to inspire myself or if I really want to educate myself. And in fact, I'm sure that over the course of this presidency, I will probably end up doing all three. At the moment, I'm really looking for some escape. Today's lecture obviously is on the Anthropologists, but I'm also, about 150 pages into Don Quixote. I'm really wanting to lose myself in a different era. So stay tuned for a future lecture on what some consider the very first novel on Don Quixote. The last thing I'll mention is if the audio isn't quite what it usually is, that is because I'm in New York and my microphone here is not working. So this is just pure Apple. This is just total MacBook. So if it sounds good, then, kudos to Apple. If it doesn't, then thank you for your patience. So as always, we're going to begin today with this question of why read this book. And in fact, today the answer is very simple. I was so drawn in by this cover. I saw it, on the front table of one of my local bookstores and was immediately drawn to it. And for some reason, I would pick it up and I would read, the jacket copy and was not sort of drawn in right away. I don't actually even know why. But then at some point at Kepler's, my local bookstore in California, it was on one of those shelves where they have, some of the incredibly smart and well-read booksellers have all of their favorite picks all out, like the staff picks. And on those shelves, I always look for books that I love and then see what else that person is recommending, which is a very tried and true and I think a very reliable way to choose a book. This book, The Anthropologists, was on a shelf with a bunch of other things that I loved. I don't recall what they were. And I was so happy actually to have an excuse. And honestly, I was so taken by this novel. It is brief, it's unique, and in many ways, even from the start, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so much grist for my mill. I was really so excited about the opportunity to sit down and really dig into it and then share what I found with you guys. And in so many ways, this book delivered on this idea of being this unique reading experience. And today's lecture is going to be a little bit different in the sense that there will be no spoilers. I am not diving into depth, into anything at the close of the book. This is a conversation that you could absolutely listen to. And in fact, I might recommend listening to it before you dive into the book, although the book is so slim and it's such a fast read, that you could do it in any way you want. But I am not going to provide any spoilers, which on some level seems kind of funny to me because this is a book that is not built around plot. This is not a book where, it's the question of like what's going to happen that is driving the reader. So the idea of me not having any spoilers is sort of silly because in fact, in some ways it would be like kind of difficult to spoil this book. But essentially what I will be talking about are things that you would encounter in the first maybe 5, 10, 15 pages, nothing really beyond that. So in many ways, I like to think that this can serve as a kind of scaffolding as you sort of dive into this book. That is such a mixed metaphor. Apologies. But, it's a way for you to, I think, maybe more fully appreciate the experience of what it is that Aysegul Savas is trying to do here. And I think in many ways is succeeding. So for those of you who like an agenda, here's what we're up to. We're going to look at Savas's goal. So I listened to a couple of interviews, did a little bit of reading, didn't really do like a deep dive in the research here, partially because there weren't as many interviews and sort of, critical pieces as I might have thought, which is fine because I had plenty to say. But she was very explicit in this one kind of goofy interview. I think it was the interviewer that struck me as a bit goofy, not Savas herself. But in this interview, she was pretty explicit about a few things in the novel. I had these kind of burning questions, and I was like, oh God, I'm gonna have to really like do all sorts of research and sleuthing. And in fact, she offered up a lot of the information I was looking for. That is information that I will be providing to you throughout the lecture. But she was very explicit about what her goal was. So we're gonna kick off with this question of like what it is that she wanted to provide the reader. And then we're gonna discuss a little bit about sort of like what this reading experience is, what it's sort of all about, because in many ways that was what drew me, and I think it's what is most successful in the novel. It's a unique reader experience and one that I really enjoyed. Okay, we're then going to dive in. We're going to talk about the cover art, the title, the dedication, and then these they're not chapter headings really, they're like section headings, section titles, so sort of the structure of the book. We're then going to talk about this notion of abstraction versus precision. So a lot of this book is really, it really sort of functions because of this incredible balance between the two. There's lots of abstraction in the book, but there's also a lot of precision. And I think the balance of it is great and it's unusual. We're then going to look at this notion. It says it right in the front of the jacket copy that this is a young couple who are looking for a home in a city. We're going to look at the way that this future home, this future apartment or loft or suburban, home, that all of these function in the novel because they have a very important function. We're going to talk about the prose. We're not going to talk too much about the bio of Aysegul Savas because this is a novel that she actually says is very autobiographical, but then they do this very cool thing where they're not providing a lot of her data. Like you can't, even in the little author bio in the back of the book, it lacks in a lot of specifics, the things that you might want to know about her. So in some ways it's kind of cagey, and I wanted to leave that to the reader because interestingly, if you have certain data about her as a writer, it does inform your reading of the novel, and I think in some ways kind of diminishes what it is that she's up to. So what Savas is very explicitly articulating is this idea, this desire that she had, this is her third novel, this desire that she had to speak about the quotidian, to speak about a relationship and to speak about everyday life, and in a way that was not boring. The other thing she wanted to do is to speak about this kind of ordinary day-to-day life through the lens of anthropology. And I am someone, I took my fair share of anthropology classes, mostly anthropological linguistics when I was in college. I loved the idea of all the ways that language shapes how we see the world. But honestly, there was like a large part of it that actually did seem kind of boring to me. So it was intriguing to think of this idea of speaking about the quotidian through the lens of anthropology and not wanting it to be boring. Part of me was like, wow, seems like kind of a dangerous combination because both of those things could be a little tedious, a little boring. But what's so interesting to me is she does both of those things so well. So I told you that this lecture is going to be a little unordinary. What we're going to do is we're going to skip all the way to page 142 because I want to show you right from the start how well she succeeds at this idea of looking at the ordinary sort of through this lens of anthropology, and how this prose that is so gorgeous, we're going to talk about the prose later and why it's very stripped down. She calls it very bland, but in fact, she does just beautiful things with language. And I want to sort of kick us off, not with the more kind of radical things that the novel is doing, but by really looking at how beautiful this prose is. But the thing that the book is sort of more known for, and the thing that I think most readers will feel more saliently, is this kind of the premise of the book, or the conceit, or the sort of gimmick, if you wanna use that word. So it's clear from. In some ways, it's clear from the jacket copy even, but it certainly becomes clear in the first couple of pages. And the conceit is this, the premise is this, that these are two people who are in a city that we don't know what the city is, and we don't know where the two people are from. And that sounds kind of basic in some ways, but it becomes this real preoccupation for the reader. So my readerly experience, it was so fascinating because I so desperately wanted to know what city they were in. And I was looking for all these context clues and looking for all of these, different ways that I could sort of orient myself in a city. And I had all of these different thoughts, which we will get to, about myself as a person and myself as a reader and just fiction in general and the things that we look for in fiction, how we want to see ourselves and we want to see familiar things. All of this was really brought to the fore because I really wanted to know, like, where are these people from? These two people are from different countries on the different sides of the world. I didn't know which countries. I really wanted to know that. And really, really, I wanted to know what this city was where they were. And in many ways, this sort of premise, and it's interesting to me that this came kind of late. So Savas has said that she didn't want to include the nationalities of the people because it would just become something else. If she were a Chinese woman, or she were an Indian woman, or she were a Russian woman in a certain city, it would take on different nuance. She didn't want any of that to inform a reader's experience of it. But until one of the very, very late drafts, the city was identified. But what was most impressive to me was just like how much I wanted to know which city it was. I stand by the conviction that none of this would work if the prose were not gorgeous. The prose, I think, is just very beautiful. So on page 142, she has a section that is called present tense. And one thing that you should know is that we have Manu and Asya. And Manu is someone who is often listening to history podcasts. And our narrator, Asya, talks at one point about how he's always lost in history and that he's never worried about the downfall of civilization, which this appealed to me. He's never worried about the downfall of civilization because he has been sort of witness in his mind to so many downfalls and so many kind of resurrections of civilization. I found that like a little optimistic glimmer for how I think some of us are feeling these days. So the idea of her chapter title as being, this little section title being present tense, in my mind, it was sort of that she is always in the present tense, looking at things through anthropological lenses. So present tense versus this idea of history, that Manu himself, who is right in front of her in this passage, is steeped in history, which is something to keep in mind as I read this gorgeous prose to you. On page 142, present tense. I was scrolling through the footage on my camera on a Sunday morning. I looked up when I heard the sound of the vacuum cleaner. Manu was pushing and pulling on the carpet with his headphones on. I suddenly saw what a gentle dance this was, his weekly waltz around our home, back and forth, out to the corners and back to the center. I turned on the camera to film him. Manu didn't notice me. He must have been listening to the history podcast that transported him on any given week to a different place. This was one reason for Manu's calm optimism, because he was constantly immersed in narratives of creation and collapse, centuries condensed into the span of 45 minutes, from which he emerged, taking off his headphones, a little transformed, back in the present world, which was no more or less strange than the one he'd just traveled to. He would summarize what he'd learned to me during walks, about the Sumerians, Assyrians, Mayans, Etruscans, and Olmecs, Siberian shamans and Baltic crusaders, skull mutilation and ritual cannibalism, the opium wars, and the craze for tulips. I retained only bits of information from his retellings, not because I wasn't interested, but because I felt assured that he was learning these things for both of us, and that I could consult him whenever I wanted, like certain books I wished to have in our library, even if I didn't intend to read them, because they provided me comfort in their silent knowledge. Meanwhile, on my camera screen, Manu unplugged the vacuum cleaner and plugged it again to the wall on the other side of the living room. He was like the people at the park, I thought, immersed in the calm of the day. So I love this. We could talk for 90 minutes just about this passage. She has beautiful figurative language here, the idea of the waltz and the dance, these sort of metaphors that she's creating, and just the quiet sort of observation here. But this idea of two people being in the same space, being able to be very far apart, but then come back together. The idea of books as being these important repositories that you can go back to again and again. And what we do have is this really beautiful, sort of comparison between this very, very vast historical landscape that she is evoking with the names of all of these people he might recite to her about, versus this idea of the very quotidian. So I just found this quiet and beautiful. You can imagine, the sound of it and maybe the light and dust motes. Like I had this very, very beautiful, it just really impressed me in terms of the prose. And before we dive too deeply into any more about the book, I think, again, it's important to underscore that none of this would work unless the prose were this great. And what I really want to underscore about that brief passage is this idea that what she wants to do, talking about the quotidian through this lens of anthropology, it really, really worked for me. And in many ways, this question of what is this city and where are these people from, anthropology truly is the best way to look at this. And on page 26 and 27, she has a section that is titled, the section title is Anthropology. And she has this very kind of succinct and very telling and very helpful sort of definition of anthropology that I found sort of helpful because, the book is literally called The Anthropologists. We are supposed to know something about anthropology. Anthropology being the study of man, anthro being man, and ology being the study of. So, I was kind of trying to remember my anthropological studies. And then early in the book on page 27, she gives us this very nice definition of what it is that anthropology is seeking. So here's what she has. She's describing an internship that she took in college. So she's discussing the internship and says this. From my handful of anthropology classes, I'd come looking for a list of specimens. Kinship structures, gift exchange, rituals, costumes, notions of the sacred and the profane. I should have known better than to expect that these would be performed daily in clean strokes for me to collect. It was just life in a somewhat ugly town. There were afternoon snacks of Fanta and stale vanilla cake. The children that came to the center wore sneakers and had cell phones. They listened to the same pop songs as the rest of the world. So this, of course, is very interesting because she expected to see things through a certain lens, and she essentially says, I did not see those, and I should not have necessarily expected them. But then it's, of course, this very cool thing where she then goes ahead and tells us some of those things. I mean, these are the kinds of rituals, these are the costumes, I mean, not the costumes, but, the attire of the people. The fact that they're all listening to the same pop songs as the rest of the world is an anthropological fact. I mean, these are traits that she is, in fact, observing about the people. So at the same time that she's kind of holding up anthropology as this rarefied and sort of scholastic lens that's going to reveal so much, she's also tipping her hand in this way that informs the whole novel, which is that essentially everything we look at as humans, everything we are observing, and everything that a novelist is telling us, all of these things can be viewed as anthropological sort of phenomena. But I did like this idea of kinship structures, gift exchange, rituals, costumes, notions of the sacred and of the profane. Sacred and profane, that really stuck with me. Good and evil too, a little bit, but sacred and profane, for some reason, it seemed like such a good way to look at a society to really figure out what is sacred and what is profane. That also may just be like, an outgrowth of what is happening in our country right now. And the structure of the book is so excellent because she is helping us to remember these kind of anthropological categories with these subtitles that she is using throughout the titles of the sections. So a couple of them we just heard: field work, principles of kinship, daily life, cosmology, intimacy, division of labor, identity as performance, native tongue, society and nature. So she's continuing to remind us, the reader, as we are moving through with these titles of sections. She does such good work with them. Okay, so now that we have taken a quick look at what Savas's goal was, I want to talk about my experience as a reader. I talked earlier about what a strong desire I had to know the city and to know the nationalities of the characters. And the other thing I want to focus on a little bit is the languages. I was so taken by this idea of like, what are their native languages? And is it English that they are speaking? I mean, presumably it's English because the novel is written in English, which is in itself something that is interesting. Presumably English was not this character, the narrator of our novel. Presumably English was not her first language, but the novel itself is in fact written. So then the question becomes like, is the author a native English speaker? It opens up all of these questions about language. And of course, in many ways, I wanted to just be chill and just be like, why does it matter? Why does it matter what city that these people are in? I wanted to be able to picture what was happening, which I think is a normal thing in a piece of writing, but I wanted it to be something I was familiar with. So I kept thinking maybe it was Paris. I thought a couple of times maybe it was London. And then I was like, wait, why is this so Eurocentric? Maybe there is a large city in Russia or somewhere in Asia that has, these lacquered cafes or whatever the thing was that I was thinking. And I realized at some point that I was choosing Paris and London in large part because I have been to those places and I really wanted to share something. I wanted to be able to sort of feel like I could identify more with these people because I could picture the places they were. And that's such an odd impulse. I mean, in many ways, we read about places we've never been to because we want to explore, armchair travel to these places we've never been. But my desire to be familiar with the surroundings were so strong. And same goes for the nationality of the characters. I wanted to know where Asya was from. I wanted to know where Manu was from. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to is because I did feel like I knew Asya so well. The first person narrator, it's told in first person, it's I and we. It's lots of I did this and I thought that and we did this, meaning she and Manu together. It was such an intimate narrator that on some level I felt like I really knew her. I felt like I was really close to her experience. And so one of these things that seems like kind of a major character, kind of identity thing is the country of origin. And then I was like, why? Why is that a thing? Why do I care what nation she's from? And obviously she herself is problematizing this idea of people being natives of a certain city and the way that makes them operate in that world. And I think there is a desire that people share, to sort of understand each other through common experiences and common rites and rituals and common language. And I loved the way that this very intimate narrator drew us in so we felt close to her. And yet there were these gulfs, there would be these things of like, I don't know what her native language is. I don't know what her favorite foods are. I don't know this city that she is in right now. And I don't know the city that she, or the country that she has come from. So this intimate narrator really throws into relief the ways that we don't know the person. And I was so taken by my reaction to it, my desperation to know. And what's interesting to me is that desperation grew right from the very beginning of the book. So now we're going to sort of take a step back and look at the book itself as if I were a reader picking it up for the first time. So first of all, we have the title, The Anthropologists. A couple of things about the title. Obviously, anthropology is right up in front and center, and I think everyone has an inkling of anthropology as being the study of humans. But what's interesting to me here is we have the definite article, the. It's not called anthropologists, because that in fact would denote a much, much larger group of people. It would sort of be all anthropologists. Here we are talking about the anthropologists, some specific ones. It's interesting to me too that it is plural. We have the anthropologists. And there is no indication in the book that Manu is an anthropologist. In fact, Manu, he's working in what I think it's like a social services kind of thing that he is doing. He works at a nonprofit. He's totally steeped in history. So the idea of the anthropologists being plural is so important. And I think what she's doing there is this idea that we are all anthropologists. I mean, again, this very intimate narrator, this I that really draws the reader in, I think what she's trying to do in many ways is to force us to think about the ways in which we also are anthropologists, the way that whatever is happening around us informs our sense of the world, and whatever sort of mysteries we have and whatever unanswered questions we have and the things that we're interested in and the things that we're investing in and asking questions about, all of that says a huge amount about us. And I, Aysegul, Savas, that we together are these anthropologists. So I loved that idea. It's an intricate one, and you have to put it together, although you assume from the beginning, although you gather from fairly early on that she is the only anthropologist in terms of the characters in the novel. So then you start thinking, okay, why plural? Who are the other anthropologists? And then you land on yourself. You land on yourself as the reader, and you're like, oh my God, literature is incredible. So the other thing, I was definitely drawn in by the cover. Those of you on the YouTube can see the cover. I have it here. It's this very beautiful green background, but we have this picture on the front. It's a hand that looks to me like a woman's hand, and it is dipping into what seems like maybe a cocktail, maybe something watered down. It's in kind of like a little cocktail glass. And it has a striped long sleeve that to me reads as very French. So part of me was like, okay, this is looking very Parisian. At first I thought it was like, my first glance, I thought it was, like a cafe table perhaps in Paris. But then I looked more closely, and what we have in the background is a radiator. So you have this idea of a more intimate space. It's a more kind of private space. Not necessarily, but I feel like, a radiator speaks to a more private space. So we have this idea here, maybe from the beginning of a home, this home that they're looking for, and this idea of things being private and being able to look into a private space. And yet this cover art also, to me, spoke about Paris, and it spoke about being a little bit more out in public. So I will, this is all with the caveat that, in fact, authors don't usually have a ton of control over what their cover art looks like. It is important, too, that on the front it says a novel. I will admit that I started reading this book, and it was in the first person, and I immediately did that thing that we are not supposed to do, where I conflated the narrator and the author, and all of a sudden I was like, wait, is this a memoir or is this a novel? And I literally closed the book and had to look, and it says a novel right on the front, because in fact it reads very much like a memoir. In the interview, she was saying that the book is widely held as autobiographical, which I did not know. I haven't read a lot about this before I dove into it, but it does beg that question that I'm eternally interested in, of sort of the line between autobiography, memoir, fiction. All of these, for me, they feel very, very blurred. And I liked the way in some ways that she was playing with that line between memoir and fiction. So as soon as I had this question of like, is this a novel? Is this a memoir? And even before that, actually, I think we do this automatically. I looked at the cover of the book, I looked at the title, and then I looked at the author name. And so when we have the author name on the cover of this book, Aysegul Savas, there's some diacritical marks here on the name, and diacritical marks being like the little umlaut. I learned from a Swedish friend recently that you do not call it an umlaut if it's over a Swedish letter. It's called the two dots, which to me sounded actually very funny, but umlaut is German. And this Swedish person was like kind of offended that I was like, oh, does it have an umlaut? And he's like, it's the two dots. So we do have something that in German would be an umlaut. I did not know this language. I did not know, because we also have something that looks like a cedilla, like the little, thing under that you would have in Spanish, under the letter C, but it's not actually a cedilla. It's just like a little comma that is underneath the S. It's so fascinating to me, and in fact very humbling, that I don't know what language this is. I don't know these diacritical marks. I don't know how to pronounce this name. I do now, because in fact during the interview the guy was saying it very pointedly, but I had to work a little bit to remember Savas. This is not a name that I am familiar with. It's also interesting to me that if you Google her name, and if you look, for example, at the New York Times review about this book, they do not have the diacritical marks. It's just written without these little marks. So I'm looking at this and I was like, oh gosh, I don't know where this person is from, which was such a beautiful thing. Again, this is like the kind of, I don't want to say gimmicky, because it didn't feel gimmicky to me. To me, it was fascinating. This idea of like, I don't know where this person is from, and yet I am so engaged with this narrator, and I'm engaged, frankly, with the cover art, and I'm engaged with everything about this book, that I'm drawn in to a world that feels destabilized because I don't recognize this alphabet. Like literally the alphabet seems a little destabilizing to me. So we're going to open the book and look at the jacket copy, because that was sort of further tantalizing, also further destabilizing in some ways. So when we open the jacket copy, sometimes I read this and sometimes I don't. I often, most of the time I think I do, but my memory is so bad that often I forget it right away, which is very handy. I'll look at it, I'll buy the book, and then I'll read the book like a few months later and not look at it again. It's one of the things I look at in a bookstore if I'm just like, do I want to read this? I'm not sure. But in this case, it kicks us off in this jacket copy with two names. Asya and Manu are looking at apartments. So right away we have these names, Asya, A-S-Y-A, and Manu. These are names also not familiar to me. And it was so interesting because in the interview, the interviewer kept saying Asia as the name of our protagonist, not Asya. So, and there is a line in the novel itself where at one point the grandmother says, we named you after an entire, I think it's the grandmother, might have been the mother. But this idea of like, we named you after an entire continent, like get out of your house and like engage with the world. And so in my mind, as an English speaker, you would think Asia. But for some reason, when I very first saw it, Asya was the way that I had also pronounced it. Maybe I just had a sense of this other language, which I didn't even know what it was. I did not pronounce her name Asia. And in fact, when I got to that point in the novel where they're like, we named you after a continent, I was like, oh, they named her after what I, as an English speaker, would call Asia. But in fact, it makes sense to me that other countries would call it Asya. But the point of all of that is right from the start, we are given these names, not their nationalities, just the names. And names throughout the entire book are very important. At one point, they talk about their neighbor. Her name is Teresa, but it's T-E-R-E-Z-A. And for me, that's not a common spelling. To me, it feels vaguely kind of Eastern European, which again, like I feel so embarrassed on some level that I don't know where these people are coming from, but I'm also absolutely delighted by the idea that this spelling of a name, I mean, I'm familiar with the name Teresa. First of all, I would say Teresa, but I'm also with like T-H-E-R-E-S-A. I have a very good friend, Teresa. But I would say Teresa, if it was T-E-R-E-S-A, I might assume that it was someone from a Spanish-speaking country. So as these things are, as these names are coming up and given their different spellings and given different diacritical marks in a given alphabet, all of that is informing our sense of who these people are. And I think very most fundamentally, you're like, why do I care what country they're from? But we do, I think it's human nature also to understand that people from different countries, think about things differently. And that is borne out in this book. There's a total disdain for vanity that, frankly, I wish that I had that disdain for vanity, but I think sometimes I am kind of a vain person. And God knows that living in America, it's very difficult to not have some vanity because of the way the media functions. But things like disdain for Vanity was something that is a value that one of these characters has, or the idea of, the spirit of generosity as being this thing where you have to stay out at night until like everybody wants to go home at the very end of the evening. I would literally die. That's my worst. I mean, I like to go to bed at 8:30. And I am the first to be like, oh, no, 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 no. I am definitely not going to that bar. I love you people, but I am not going out. People might, if the spirit of generosity in a culture where that you needed to stay out until the wee hours of the morning, I would not do very well in that culture because I would be seen as totally ungenerous. So I'm kind of digging in certain ways because I'm grappling with this idea of like, why do I care where these people, why does it matter that they come from a different country? Which is not to say that we can't understand each other and that we can't become very intimate friends or intimate, partners or whatever the thing is. But it is fascinating to see the ways that we are drawn or sort of repelled by our lack of understanding. And of course, all of this, like looking at other people's cultures, really asks us to also be looking at our own, of course. So as you might imagine, I was looking at the cover of the book, I looked at the jacket copy, and because of the name of the author as being not familiar to me, I went right to the back and I was like, okay, what is this? Who is this Savas? I did not know how to say that. I think I said probably like Savas, maybe. That's to me sounded more familiar in some ways. But we do have at the end of the book this author bio that I was really looking to like provide me some key information that is the stuff of author bios at the back of a book. So this is part of the jacket copy. We have a picture of Aysegul Savas. I mean, I'm laughing because maybe I'm totally mispronouncing her whole name. But here we have Aysegul Savas is the author of the acclaimed novels Walking on the Ceiling and White on White. Her work has been translated into 6 languages and has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Granta, and elsewhere. She lives in Paris. So, part of that information is telling the idea that she lives in Paris. She's tipping her hand a little bit. This idea of her living in Paris together with the striped shirt and the sort of cafe vibe that I was getting from the front did make me think, okay, maybe the city that she's talking about is Paris. The fact that the city is obscured in certain ways, which we're going to get to, I feel like she was kind of trying to throw me off the trail. And that was interesting too. But what's missing from that author bio, and this is information that is often included, is, where she is from, and certainly where she is from, whether or not she has a partner, whether or not she has children. This is all information that is interesting to me and maybe would have informed the book. But then you take a step back and you're like, why? Why would it inform the book if she had a partner or didn't have a partner? It's a novel, but it is this human nature thing to sort of want to have a sense of who is it who is writing this and what is it of their own life experience that is informing or giving them authority to tell me the things that they're going to tell me in this novel. Before we move away from the cover and dive into the book, I want to just look at the 2 blurbs that they have on the front. One is by Garth Greenwell. I don't actually know who that is. And it's simply the word mesmerizing. And I absolutely agree with this. I found this book kind of hypnotic, kind of mesmerizing, kind of quiet in this really intriguing and sort of comforting and beautiful way. So I absolutely agreed with mesmerizing. The other one over here is by someone named Brian Washington. I also don't know who that is, which maybe I should be embarrassed about that. But the it's kind of running up the side here vertically, and it says the following: Savas is an author who simply and astoundingly knows. And I was like, what does that mean? I don't understand what that means. And in fact, in many ways, I think that, yes, Savas is someone who knows, but what she's interested in lots of ways, for my money, is what we don't know, is sort of these lacunae, these like blanks, these sort of empty things, or these gulfs, between people. So this idea that she like knows, I'm not sure. I was resisting that. Apologies maybe to Brian Washington. And this is a little bit out of context, but the idea here is much more about her curiosity and the ways that she is asking the reader to both participate and to fill things in, but also this idea of asking the reader to sort of not know. She's literally asking the reader, like, don't know where these people are from and don't know, like, imperative, like, don't know the city, like, sit with this uncertainty. So in some ways, I thought that was funny, the idea that Savas knows. So then as we dive in, we pass the beautiful title, The Anthropologists, and then we come to the dedication for Max. It's M-A-K-S. I would say Max. Maybe it's Max. I don't know. I love the fact that I don't know the pronunciation. Again, we have a little more space between this individual reader and the name of the person who is named in the dedication. And then we have, and for my grandfather. I loved that so much when I went back and looked at it. So in the novel, there are a lot of intergenerational things happening. So we have the mother and we have the father. I found it fascinating that her parents are split. So she has interactions with her father and with her mother that are separate and very, very different. And I loved that. To me, it was very interesting to look at the way that one woman interacted with her mother and her father in these very different ways. With the mother, we also have the maternal grandmother. And in the interview, Savas was speaking to this idea of wanting intergenerational feel, like wanting there to be that depth in the novel. And it seems so important and so perfect to me because this is a novel about family, and it's a novel about extended family, meaning family that is across the globe, like physically extended family, and the idea of being far from family and missing out on things. So you have this sense of this young woman who is very close with her grandmother. And even as these changes are occurring in the grandmother's life, our young narrator cannot, in fact, be with that grandmother. We also, Teresa, who is that neighbor, whose name is spelled with a Z, she in many ways is a very clear foil. She's a very clear stand-in for the grandmother. And I loved her as a character. And I thought it was very effective the way that we have this very close tie with this older woman, with this grandmother figure and these sort of multiple generations. We have in the city itself, the unknowable city, we have this kind of multi-generational thing. And then we also have our narrator, with her sort of blood ties, her principles of kinship, both kinship that she is choosing, her chosen family in the city, her chosen grandmother, and then also her actual grandmother. She said a thing about gossip when she was talking about the grandmother, or maybe it was her mother, that I loved. She essentially was like, I think, shit-talking about maybe her mother-in-law or something. Don't quote me on that. And she was saying this to her mother, and she said something about how she was gossiping and saying these things in order to signal to her mother that she didn't belong to that family, that she belonged to her family of origin. And I was so taken by that. I'm interested in notions of gossip and ways that it's both very good and very bad. And that idea of signaling to someone through gossip that you in fact belong to them, or that you belong with them and not with the other people. This is the kind of observation that she has throughout that is so compelling. Also amidst just this beautiful sort of meditations on daily life and what things look like, and the importance of different sort of quotidian rituals or habits. But I loved this idea of really delving into what it meant to sort of gossip with one family member, and how that really cemented her position in her family of origin. And yet I digress. So if you go back, which it's always so interesting to go back, and you look at the dedication, this is dedicated to Max, who presumably is maybe her son. I don't know. Maybe it's her husband. I'm not sure. And then to her grandfather. And so you have a sense that perhaps her grandfather, this is me making so much conjecture, but I was like, maybe her grandfather died. Maybe her grandfather was far away when he died. And that's not spoiling anything that happened in the book. But this sense of, when you dedicate something to someone, sometimes it's because they have died. So you have this idea of these intergenerational people in the book, but they're female. And then you have this dedication to presumably to male figures in the dedication, which I liked that. It's sort of this idea like pointing out the artifice. Like it's her grandfather that she maybe misses, and yet she's writing about a grandmother because she wants there to be a certain distance between her life as an author and the protagonist's life as a character in the novel. And then finally, we're going to open the book. So one thing I will say right away is that the structure of the book pushes against the idea of the novel. So usually in a novel, if you have a chapter title, it's like the chapter, you have the chapter title and then it's a relatively lengthy chapter. Sometimes you might have like part 1 and then a title. There can be all different ways to structure it. But right on the very first page, we have in bold this typeface, the section heading right from the beginning. And there are 2 of them. There are 2 sections on the first page. So we know right away that this is a book where we're going to have a section heading and a chunk of text, and then some space, lots of white space in this book. This book really just zips right along because in fact there's a lot of space on the page. So we have the title, the chunk of text, another title, another chunk of text. So right from the beginning, we're primed to think, okay, more of a meditation in some ways, or more of like a journal, or more of like a field report. I don't actually remember how you're supposed to structure those, but you get that sense of it not being particularly novelistic. And in many ways it's not. And there were a couple of times where I was like, oh, I wish this were a little more novelistic. The time most acutely that I'm thinking of is that character Sarah. We have the character Sarah, and I really loved her. She's the college friend, I think, of our protagonist. of Asya. And Sarah comes and visits, and then we suddenly move on to the next section, and Sarah is gone. And I was like, wait, I want more Sarah. I want to know what's going to happen with Sarah. And, she comes back up at different points in the novel, so we do get more of her. But I really loved, even as I was sort of frustrated and like, oh, I wish this were more novelistic, I really loved the idea of this structure as making the reader aware of kind of normal, not normal, and like conventional novelistic structure versus this idea of this kind of more episodic and more sort of vignette-like prose. So here we have at the very beginning, beginnings and endings, which it's so interesting because that's a very novelistic thing. You need a beginning and a middle and an end, but we're having the beginnings and the endings. First of all, they're plural. We have more than one beginnings and we have more than one endings. So she's both sort of reminding us that a novel might have a beginning and an end, but she's also pushing against it by providing multiple of both and providing the endings up front. So she says this: beginnings and endings. In a moment of panic, we decided to look for a home. We'd been in the city for several years by then, and from time to time we worried that we weren't living by the correct set of rules, that we should be making our lives sturdy. I worried more than Manu did, but he often acquiesced to my apprehensions. So right from the beginning here, I love that the very first personal pronoun we come across is we. So it's a narrative that is told in the first person. Sometimes it's the first person singular, I did this, I did that, and sometimes it's the first person plural, we did this and we did that. It's very difficult to write with any kind of sustained prose in the second person plural, we did this, we did that. It gets tiresome for obvious reasons, but I love the fact that we is the very first thing. So she's signaling up front that there is this unit, and it is the narrator at this point and this person Manu. And right at the end, we have this very first line, and I love typographically because the last line, the last word of the line is also the last word of the sentence. So our eye is moving along this first line, and the last word is home, and then we have the period. So this emphasis on home, it's also, we didn't need to find a place to stay. We didn't need to find an apartment. We didn't even need to find a house. We needed to find a home. So, in English, there's a lot of nuance about house versus home. And so right away, this idea of wanting a home, so it's very important that we have panic and then we have home. So right at the beginning, there's a lot of tension. And then right in the second line, we'd been in the city for several years by then. And the city, like right from the beginning, it's not this city or that city, it's the city. So we have the definite article, we know it's one city, and it's obscured. I mean, normally you'd been like, we'd been in Paris for the song, or we'd been living in London for such and such a time, because you would want the reader to orient themselves very quickly and in a very efficient way. And in this sense, it's very, I literally write on I have two question marks, the we, I had a question mark like, who is this we? We don't know who that is yet. And the city, we don't know what the city is. So right from the beginning, she's serving up these kind of mysterious and yet very kind of concrete and very simple ideas, these sort of images. And then I loved that the second little chunk that we have beginnings and endings, we have a relatively short paragraph, and then we have cosmology. So cosmologies are so interesting to me. Cosmology speaks to the way that someone sort of sees themselves like in the biggest sense. Like if you had a Christian cosmology or like or like an astrological cosmology, sort of like how you see like your origins and sort of your like you're kind of, I'm actually looking, if you're on YouTube, I've got like my astrological situation behind me here. I'm not a huge believer in astrology. I read something recently about how like the thing, like the calendar that we base all of those on, like it's like an ancient one, so it doesn't even apply to like the times that we were born. But I love the images, and I love to sort of dabble in it. In fact, that speaks to my desire for some sort of cosmology. I'm not a religious person, so I don't like ascribe to like a very religious cosmology. And I actually don't prescribe to the zodiac either, but it shows this idea of like the human desire for some way to sort of look at the world in an orderly fashion. So she gives us cosmology, which really, would speak to perhaps, some sort of ideas of faith, or like whether or not there's predetermination, or whether or not we have free will, like these really large questions. So, and the idea of cosmology, of course, coming from like the idea of the cosmos. So this idea of planets, and this idea of like literally like where are we situated in like the galaxy, this very large way that we situate ourselves, sort of in space and time and in the world. And what I love is that the cosmology has everything to do with her and Manu. It's really just about the two of them. It's such a lovely way to speak to the solidity of their relationship at the beginning here, and also just how important that is. So this is, and then this is what she says. For many years, it had been just the two of us. When we met, the world expanded and it also contracted. It stretched large enough for the two of us, a whole universe, and it left everything else behind a curtain. We were so young then, barely out of childhood. So this is so beautiful. I mean, again, we have the university campus, we have the town. Those are very abstract terms. We don't know, which university, we don't know which town, which of course piqued my curiosity even further. And the cosmology, the idea of them being a huge universe, so the idea of their lives having expanded but also contracted. There's a lot in here about the kind of smallness of their lives. Throughout the novel, she's feeling like she doesn't have enough community. So I loved the idea of these titles as working so well because of this idea of cosmology. So she says one thing at the end of that section that I think is worth repeating, because I want to move now to talk about the idea of abstraction versus precision. She talks about going into town and seeing these older people. On weekends, we'd walk off the university campus to spend the day in town, among older people whose lives seemed at once real and unreal. Real because that was how we imagined actual life in the abstract. Unreal because it did not seem we would ever be like them. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things I think she does so well, and one of the reasons why this reading experience feels unique and interesting and compelling to me and not, in fact, gimmicky, is because she has this perfect balance of the abstract and the precise. So I think a lot of us, when we think of the novel, we think of, actually I'm thinking here right now of Don Quixote, because Don Quixote is often thought of as the very first novel in lots of ways. But I think when we think, which we'll get to in the lecture when I get around to that, but in many ways, when we think about the novel, we think about the kind of realist novel. So think Flaubert or John Steinbeck or Henry James, these novels that, you have, some inciting incident, you have rising action, you have the climax, you have the denouement and the falling action and the denouement. So we have, our sort of typical triangle. We have beginning, middle, end, and we have a very large amount of detail. And in many ways, the typical novelist feels like their main job is to convince the reader that this world is real, that there's a certain verisimilitude that you have. So a lot of the sort of verisimilitude, a lot of this kind of like real feeling of the novelistic fictional world comes from tons and tons of detail. So for example, Flaubert said at one point that he wanted to describe everything. He wanted, as opposed to the things, from the 18th century, think like essays, he really wanted to include everything. He wanted to show you, like where people went to the bathroom and what they were eating and how they had sex. So all of that detail he wanted to include in the novel. And so, and in many ways, it does help build a fictional world. But what she is doing here is giving us some things that are very precise, but a lot of it is very abstract. And I loved this part, like my delving into this part, because I really wanted to know how she pulled it off so well. It was the perfect level of abstraction and of precision. I want to take a look at page 44 because she kind of articulates this idea. She's having this discussion with Manu, and this has to do with anthropology, which is that there is a woman from a very small town who wrote an autobiography about a memoir. They're largely the same thing. Autobiography tends to be like more kind of factual, and memoir tends to be more, talking in a slightly more full way with like lots of detail and sort of painting a picture for the reader, not simply giving like dates and facts and whatnot. So there was this woman who wrote this autobiography / memoir about her life in this village, and there was a professor of anthropology who happened to be there, and the professor wrote this kind of rebuttal that was like, this isn't at all what life is like in this place. And so, which is a very interesting thing, because you have this idea of fact and fiction and sort of whose responsibility it is. Manu comes down on the side of the professor and says it is the professor's, responsibility to speak to the truth about life in a certain village. And you can't have these kinds of elaborations or exaggerations or whatever falsehoods that people were seeing in the autobiography / memoir of the woman. You can imagine that I, like Asya, am on the side of the woman in the sense of like, what is truth? I mean, anthropology speaks to get at truth, like capital T truth, which great, good for anthropology, but I'm a little suspicious. And frankly, I would rather have a picture painted for me. Certainly going to read that before I'm going to read some anthropological treatise. So this has become a debate between Asya and Manu, and she says this. But later, once we settled in the city, I was no longer sure what I thought. It wasn't that I had come to agree with Manu. Rather, I mistrusted the woman's process of abstraction, simply because I'd grown weary of life in the abstract. For most of the people we were acquainted with, Manu and I were nothing much more than our countries of origin, our accents, our work, and I yearned for a specific existence. So this is so powerful. And again, this is why I think her abstraction works so well. We make so many assumptions about people. You hear an accent, you know where they're from, and you have your like very, in many cases, very limited sense of what that life would be like. And yet we make these assumptions. Or just because of human nature, because of language barriers, or simply because of time and how busy we are, the kinds of interactions that we have with people, or long-held beliefs that have been passed down through generations, which are often very dangerous, we have these preconceived notions. So she's pushing against this idea of abstraction. And what she does with the abstraction through the book is because it's kind of neutral in many ways, it challenges this idea of preconceived notions. So we're going to take a look at this abstraction and then the precision. On page 12, this is a little section, the section title is The City. Manu and I had lived in other places together, but something about this city reflected the cadences and proportions we wanted from life. Its hours ticked alongside our own. We admired its colors and edges and embellishments, the organization of its neighborhoods. I cannot say that we felt familiar, only that we wanted to become familiar, and so we accepted the city's ways. I love this. In some ways, it's very abstract, this idea of the cadences and proportions. She's not telling us what that cadence is. We don't know if it's kind of like a frenetic New York City versus a sleepy, I don't know, I want to say Cincinnati. I have no idea. I've never been to Cincinnati. But, she's not telling us specifically what these things are, but she's telling us the kinds of things that humans tend to notice about cities, which is so satisfying in and of itself. Things like cadence and proportion and colors and edges and embellishments and the organization of its neighborhoods. That to me speaks to Paris a little bit, and like those, the consistency of the architecture and the way that all of those neighborhoods were all laid out. But who knows? Maybe she's speaking to like the chaotic nature of London and the way those neighborhoods are all laid out. So I love the way that she's inviting us to think about, like, what are these categories? What are the things that we prioritize, or how are we taking in a certain city? So she's being both abstract and also somewhat precise. So that articulation of like what it is that we look for in cities, or kind of how we absorb cities around us, that was on page 12. But on pages 6 and 7, so like really very close to the opening of the book, I had begun like my frenzied sleuth to try to figure out what city this was. And I was very acutely aware the whole time, like, why do I care? And yet I really do seem to care. They had looked at one of the many places, one of the apartments that they were thinking of purchasing. So, and then afterward, they're together. We have this on page 6. Afterward, we sat at the cafe down the street, with a red lacquered facade and marbled tables. If we were to live there, we said, we'd come to this cafe for lunch and late-night drinks, would know the waiters by name. So I'm literally, like, in my marginalia here, I have underlined red lacquered facade and marble tables, and I have Paris in the question. Like, I'm at the beginning of the book, and yet I really want to pin down this country, and I was sure that, like, red lacquered facade and marble tables meant Paris. But that's when I stepped back, and I'm like, why am I being so Eurocentric? Who knows? I don't know. Maybe there are many other countries that have that sort of, that's one way that they have cafes. But then a little further down, literally the very next paragraph, a few days after seeing the apartment, we met up with our friend Ravi at a bar in our neighborhood. We met there whenever we thought we'd have a quick drink, and almost always ended up ordering a platter of fried onions and sweet potatoes and mozzarella sticks, which made us feel sick a few hours later. And in my mind, I mean, I have not spent a ton of time in Paris, but I was like, sweet potatoes and mozzarella sticks. I'm like, that doesn't sound like Paris. So then I was like, food? ? I mean, this is the extent of my discomfort. Like, I really wanted to be right about where they were, which was just so weird. And I think very, it really helps us as readers understand the way that we want to situate ourselves in a text. And then the very next line, we sat at the bar drinking pints of lager and showed Ravi pictures of the apartment from the real estate website. And I literally was like, pints of lager. England? Like this is kind of how I was working. And then actually on page 8, so a couple of pages later, they're on a picnic and they're talking about chips and beer. And so chips to me, would have been like potato chips. And in England, they would have said crisps. So the fact that she says chips and beer, I was like, oh my God, wait, maybe it's Paris. But like, this is the kind of frenzy. And then right across the page on 7, when they're showing Ravi the pictures on the website, Ravi took the phone from Manu, Ravi took the phone from Manu. He zoomed in on the round window above the reading nook. Damn, he said, the Royal Navy. And for me, that I pictured one of those incredible dormer windows in France with where they have the mansard roofing and they have those beautiful, I think they're called like ox eye windows or something, those beautiful round windows with the kind of eave all around them. But then when he says the Royal Navy, for whatever reason, I went straight to England. So this kind of back and forth between London and Paris both made me, it was intriguing and I liked it. But I also, you take a step back and you're like, why? Why does it matter so much? But then also, again, this level of abstraction and precision, we know that they're having, fried onions and sweet potatoes and mozzarella sticks. That is incredibly precise. But then we have these very abstract notions of things like cadence or the type of architecture that it is that they are surrounded by. So it's this really great balance. So I want to just touch on 3 more of these examples. They're actually different. So we see this both precision and abstraction in terms of description of the spaces where they are, but also in terms of language. And I was really, again, like doing this whole hunting thing. So we have fairly early on page 15, one of the clues about the language. So as I'm looking for clues about what this city is, of course you want to know the language that people are speaking. And then I realized that the language they're speaking doesn't necessarily indicate anything because it could be simply the common language that all of these expats are all using, in order to have a common language together, even if they were in France, for example. So on page 15, we have this. Lena didn't switch to English, as natives often did upon hearing my accent, or some error in conjugation. So what this assumes is that she is speaking in a language that is not English. So when she makes an error in this other language, and then people usually switch to English, that is assuming that this is not an English-speaking country. So that is adding, in fact, to my sleuthing that we might, in fact, be in Paris. But it's a very convoluted way that she's talking about it. Like the idea of switching into English makes it sound like English is the language that's being spoken in this city. So all of my preoccupation about what language people are operating in, right from the beginning, it's a little cagey, but you can also make, again, a lot of assumptions about English as being this kind of, as globalization, and unfortunately as English being the default in lots of places. The last thing I'll say about language is just that I found a couple of kind of British-isms. At one point, she said that it had a different atmosphere to something else. And in English, or in American English, we would say different atmosphere from something else. So there were a couple of things like that. And at one point, she talked about pens being stacked in pottery. And I was like, that does not seem to me like someone who grew up speaking English. So, and I don't know that that's the case. I'm not sure. Maybe you could stack pens in pottery. But the point is that I was very alert to this question of like, is this person a native English speaker? Are they writing in English? Or, if they aren't, then like this idea of writing in English, like Samuel Beckett, for example, who was, Irish and spoke English, he famously wrote in French in order to distance himself from the language. So part of me was like, what is this experience of this woman who is this author who is writing this protagonist where English is not her native language? But like, what is that gap like between the native language of both the protagonist and the author and what we see on the page? It's so interesting to think about. So we have that kind of precision plus abstraction in terms of language. We also have it in terms of description of people. So in a section titled Neighbors, we have this description of Teresa. She was very small, which was a surprise each time we saw her, as if she had sprung out of a fairy tale. She had bright blue eyes and wore theatrical clothes in unexpected combinations. Canvas and silk, velvet and plastic beads. At first I had taken her outfits as a sign of eccentricity or of an artistic sensibility, but she was simply childish. She delighted in life. So as she is walking through these things, like what she is wearing, her bright blue eyes, even her stature, as a reader, I'm making certain assumptions about her. And in the case of Teresa, also with the Z in her name, I was piecing together these very precise things, and yet in the abstract, we don't know what country she's from. And here, for whatever reason, it wasn't, maybe because these precise details really did paint a certain picture. I also, by page 22, you have a slightly better sense. You have a little more stability in terms of who Asya is and who Mano is, and perhaps even the city in which they are dwelling. But even this idea that she had sprung out of a fairy tale, you're kind of like, wait, whose fairy tale? Are we talking about a French fairy tale? Are we talking about a fairy tale from Manu's country, from Asya's country of origin? And the idea of a fairy tale as being an English word, if we're talking about stories about fairies, it does, I begin to wonder, like in Asya's country of origin, are the stories also about fairies? So each one of these notes of precision, if you are slowing down and allowing this book to do what it should be doing, it really multiplies into all of these questions that really speak to how we conceive of ourselves and our identities and our connections with other people. The last thing I want to touch on here in terms of the precision and the abstraction is this excellent paragraph that has to do with this question of finding a home. This is not in one of the sections where they're looking at one of the potential places to buy, but it is a time when Asya has decided to go out into the suburbs with Lena, her one native friend. I thought it was also clever that Lena, Lena is the name. It could be French, it could be English. It's not, her name is not Françoise, and it's not like Sophie. It's not a name that would situate us in one country or another. But we have this excellent paragraph on 54, which is just a masterclass in like both precise and abstract. Lena's mother greeted us at the door and hugged us both. It had been so long since I had visited such a home, and I realized that I hadn't brought anything as a gift. I mumbled something in apology, and Lena's mother made a gesture as if swatting my words. So this is so beautiful. And anthropologically speaking, there is so much in this paragraph. Lena's mother is someone who is hugging both of them at the door. So you have this idea of physical warmth and affection. But then this idea of it had been so long since I had visited such a home. We don't have any idea what this home looks like. We know it's in the suburbs, but there's very little about what the house actually looks like. But just from the embrace of this mother, the fact that she hugs both of them, you get this sense of the whole entire home, and also this impulse that she should have brought a gift, which is one of these customs. This is a custom that is maybe customary in Asya's home country, and maybe also in this country where we find her. But I really love the idea of such a home. Like in my mind, I pictured the home of like the suburban home of this big European capital. Again, I'm assuming it's European. I'm not quite sure why. So it's evoking something in my mind, which is kind of the perfect thing for a mother who is warm and someone who lives in the suburbs. And whatever you were picturing or going to picture is going to be slightly different, but it's going to be sort of the perfect home for you. So it's so artful the way that she says such a home, because she's not giving us precision, but we are supplying a lot of the precision that we would need. So I want to move on from this idea of abstraction and precision to a slightly more general discussion of the prose. I was talking earlier about how beautiful I think the prose is. And one of the things that Savas says in the interview is that she purposefully was using very bland language. And she explained it a bit, that like by bland, what she meant was that she didn't want to have a lot of signifiers that would tip the reader off to like where this person was from, or, things that might be classist, or things that might be particularly telling about this person. So, and I like the idea of the language being bland, and the idea that it lends to this abstraction. It would be much harder to give abstraction if you were using a certain sort of verbiage, or a certain regional language, or a certain dialect. I mean, if you think about it in those terms, it becomes clearer that this is a version of English that is fairly stripped down and fairly plain. So it makes sense to me that you would need that kind of bland English in order to have abstraction. But one of the things I was most impressed by is the figurative language in the book. So figurative language is simply language that is doing something other than what it is actually denoting. So if you have a metaphor or a simile or something that is symbolic or foreshadowing, so you have what the words are actually saying, and then you have this kind of extra meaning, this kind of extra nuance. And what's so interesting about figurative language in this book is that the whole reason you have figurative language, if you are a writer, is in order to help your reader understand something better. So if you say something X is like something Y, and one of those things or both of those things are familiar to your reader, you're going to enhance the understanding of X because you are comparing it to Y. So if this is a book where the reader is supposed to be somewhat destabilized, then figurative language is going to both, I think, help stabilize the reader, but in certain cases might sort of destabilize further. So most of the figurative language language I found incredibly effective. And you people who've listened to the Fox page know that I'm incredibly picky about metaphor and simile. I'm just like, this is not required. If you're not good at metaphor and simile, just don't do it. And I think most people agree with this. A metaphor is most successful when the two objects that are being compared are somewhat close together and close enough so that a nuance is added, but it can't be something that's really far. Like if it's too wacky and your reader's like, wait, what? Like, what does letter Q have to do with X? Then your reader is pulled out of the narrative and you're lost. So I was so impressed with the figurative language, and I want to take a quick look at it. So this is on page 63. This is Asya's mother who's giving her marital advice and is basically like, don't be so hard on Manu, which is interesting. I mean, once you're in the anthropological mindset, you're analyzing everything, all of this kind of, intergenerational wisdom and all of these different preconceived notions about marriage and union. This is a couple who is deciding where to live, but they're also deciding who they're going to be as adults. You know that from the very first page. So obviously the adults in their lives are both models and cautionary tales. So all of the stuff that the parents are saying and doing and the way that they're acting, all of it is under a certain kind of microscope here, to use a metaphor myself. So we have Asya and her mother speaking. This is page 63. Asya, my mother said, sweetheart, don't try his patience. I played along with her vision of a marriage where the couple was entangled in a rigid and elaborate dance whose harmony would be disrupted by stepping out of line. It's so beautiful. I mean, what's interesting here, too, is there's a lot of specificity. It's a rigid and elaborate dance, and then the dance has a certain harmony. And then this idea that the harmony would be disrupted. It's disrupted there. It's not a word that you would necessarily use with the idea of music and dancing. So it's sort of adding a certain force. And then the idea of stepping out of line, of course, that's one of these like received phrases that you shouldn't step out of line. That is in some ways cliche, but it's very well done here because it speaks to this idea of conformity. So she has what I think is actually a fairly like elaborate metaphor here, and it works so well. So the first figurative language that we see, and this is one that actually comes up several different times, is when her mother and grandmother ask Asya if she has planted any seeds in her window box. So this idea of planting seeds and taking root, all of that is highly symbolic. And again, that's something that comes up again and again. And it's not heavy-handed. I mean, you could see a universe where like them being like, honey, have you put down roots in your foreign country yet? It could feel kind of too overt, and yet it is not because she does it so well. The last one I want to look at is very brief, and it's hardly even a metaphor, but I really loved it. This is the kind of... yes, the writing is very bland, but then she has these kinds of images or these turns of phrase that are so evocative and interesting to me. And this one was exactly that. So they're looking for some information, some sort of like banking information that they need. And they have all of the stuff in these two envelopes. And she says this. They contained our birth and marriage certificates, insurance cards, past visas and passports, bank statements, apartment lease, medical forms, printouts of visa applications, the exoskeletons of passport photos with only a single picture remaining. I mean, that is so beautiful. You guys, as I read that aloud, it has such beautiful cadence. It's almost poetic. What I love there, and you might guess, is the idea of the exoskeletons of passport photos. So that's metaphorical in the sense that it's not an actual exoskeleton. It's not, you like an exoskeleton's like, like a bony skeleton of, I don't know, like a hermit crab or like maybe a spider. I think a spider has an exoskeleton where the skeleton is on the outside. But the exoskeleton of that passport photo, you can totally picture it. The white glossy card that has like the two photos that they have you take, and then where they have that thing that I can hear it right now in my mind where it goes thunk, and like, they cut out the perfect thing at the passport office. It's so evocative, but also in my mind it was turned into this other thing, because the idea of it being an exoskeleton, it's the idea of something that is left behind, something that is dead, something that is something that is empty in certain ways. I just loved it. It was both familiar and also changed in some ways the way that I will always look at, that last passport photo that's kicking around in that weird envelope that you have with all the like crucial papers all shoved into it. Also, though, interesting, both the specificity here and the abstraction here, the idea of past visas and passports, apartment lease, medical forms, visa applications. We don't know where these passports are for. We don't know what the visa applications are looking like. So there's that specificity. And what's beautiful about both the specificity and the abstraction here is everyone can relate. Everyone has this envelope that has all this stuff shoved in it from the past years. And when you need the one thing and you're panicked and you're looking through everybody, in the universality of these forms, it allows us even more intimacy with this narrator, who's very intimate in many ways, even before we have this universal envelope of all the junk that everybody has. Before we move on from prose and talk about this last chunk we're going to talk about, which is these future apartments and what they say about these people and the importance of them in the text, I want to take a look at the humor. I found this book, I loved the humor. It wasn't like hilarious all throughout, and it isn't meant to be like a comic novel, but I loved the subtlety and sort of the warmth in a lot of the humor. Notably, I think it was kind of funnier in the second half. All of my examples of humor tend to be in the second half of the book. So I want to take a look at how she pulls this off. On page 87, by the time we took our seats, Teresa was flushed with excitement. She read the program out loud, exclaimed when the music started. A few people around us shushed her, and Teresa shouted that she was very sorry. By Dvorak, she was asleep. So it's kind of unexpected and cute, and you have this kind of like build-up, and then you have this kind of unexpected outcome. It's so good. There's another thing. There are actually quite a few examples of that kind of humor where you're sort of building towards something expected, and then at the end you have this kind of simple and endearing thing that you didn't expect to happen. One of the other examples is like they're lying in bed together and they're like thinking about all these things that they have to do, and it was like, we had so much to do, so we stayed in bed. So this idea, just like here, by Dvorak, she was asleep. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that, Dvorak. On page 96, we had one example of specificity that really stuck out for me. So it is this. On page 96, what if, Manu asked, I discovered that Asya had been sneaking off to a knitting club every week? I might feel abandoned. Couldn't you give me a more alluring double life? I pleaded. So I love that, of course, because as many of you know, I consider myself quite the fiber artist. For those of you on YouTube, I'm wearing what I used to call my masterpiece. It's kind of like an Irish, like fisherman's knit kind of sweater. It is delicious. It's very soft. I really love it. It used to be my masterpiece, but recently I completed like a Fair Isle thing, and I don't have it here with me. I'll feature it in something else, but that is my new masterpiece. So knitting is something that, you know, I love the idea of knitting. Do I like really love the idea of myself as a knitter? Or is my secret special, like, you know, double life going to be like something about knitting? No. So I very much identified with this idea of Asya as being like, wait, a knitting club? That's how you see me in my secret other life? So I very much enjoyed that humor. I think one of the things that was very appealing about this exchange is that you see, there are lots of ways where you see the intimacy and the humor that the two of them share. It helps you understand why, in fact, they are so compatible. And then we have this very funny thing on 145. They're with a bureaucrat, and he says the following. We see that Madame is a freelance earner. From his expression, we could tell this was a troubling type of earner to be. So what's beautiful here is the repetition of earner. It just is so good. I'm going to read it again. We see that Madame is a freelance earner. From his expression, we could tell this was a troubling type of earner to be. There's also something about the cadence. It actually weirdly sounds like Dr. Seuss to me. This is a troubling kind of earner to be. It's just so to her credit that in a book that is kind of quiet and subtle, there is a lot of humor that I find totally endearing. We're going to close today with a brief discussion about the importance of this apartment hunting that they are doing. We're going to go back very briefly to the jacket copy. Asya and Manu are looking at apartments, envisioning their future in a foreign city. What should their life look like? What rituals will structure their days? Whom can they consider family? So in lots of ways, this is exactly why I don't like to read I actually don't remember that. I think all I read was like the top part, which is all in bold. It's in bold and it's in capital. All it says at the top is Asya and Manu are looking at apartments. I was like, okay, good. That's all I need to know. And then these questions that follow, I think actually sort of tip her hand in ways that is not great. And I'm not even going to read the bottom three paragraphs. Like that's just the top one asking some questions. Of course, those are the big questions. So we know right from the beginning that they're looking at apartments, but this search for apartments becomes very, very important. And in the interview that I heard, but also in the novel itself, she articulates this very clearly. So one thing to think about first and foremost, is that each one of these sections where they are looking at an apartment is called future selves. So you'll have future selves, and then it immediately will be like, you know, the next day, Manu and I went out to the periphery of the city they didn't say periphery because that would be the périphérique, which would mean Paris. So I don't think she would tip her hand in quite that way. I did wonder throughout if she was purposefully obscuring, if she was like kind of throwing us off the trail. Again, like with the onions and sweet potatoes, that's not something that I think of as being particularly Parisian. And I was like, I don't know, maybe I really actually don't know, maybe it is. But I did wonder if she was throwing us off the trail with different details here and there. Not things that are like not true or totally incongruous, but things that were just more subtle. On page 64, we have a very good example of this. The section title is Future Selves. We viewed another house in the suburbs at the end of the northern line. So the idea here of future selves, as always entitling these sections, is very telling. And if you are an astute reader, you should be making ties between what these section titles are talking about and what the text below them is reading. It was very interesting to me. In some ways, she works against them. Like principles of kinship, sometimes it will be about family, but often it's about something where you have to work a little bit and be like, wait, what does this have to do with kinship? So it's really cool that in lots of ways they indicate something fairly straightforward, but it's also just as cool when she's kind of pushing against whatever the title is. And in fact, future selves doesn't necessarily speak to the idea of hunting for these apartments, but what she's doing is helping us understand something that she articulates on page 65. There was the pace of the city, the anonymity, the stress. There was the wish to live another type of life, with real neighbors and homegrown vegetables. I felt stifled by the clarity of my knowledge, which seemed unreal or too real, as if everyone ended up living the same sort of life, describing it with the same words. With enough focus, I could probably predict our lives as well, the types of people we would resemble. There was something inevitable in choosing, in looking ahead. There were only so many options. But just now, I preferred not to think about it too much. So in this case, she's talking about there not being very many options, but there are other times where she talks actually about being overwhelmed by how many options there are. And in the interview in specific, she talked about this idea that because in the book, the protagonist and her partner are both from other places, they get to define everything. They get to define their rites and their rituals and what they think of as sacred and profane. And one of the ways that they would define themselves most clearly, both for themselves and for other people, is in the home that they choose to purchase. And you have this beautiful array of homes. You know, you have this very museum-like apartment, and then you have a loft where you have a family. I think that's where the family is, and it feels like kind of gentrified and like slightly suburban. And in some you have children, and you have an idea of like lots of chaos and energy, and in other places you have the sense of calm. So all of these different choices are both, in some ways, it's inevitable. They're going to end up living together in a place, and it will define them. And there are all sorts of things that will feel very much like other people, but also the idea of being able to choose is really overwhelming for her. So if you take that one step further, and this is where I'm going to end, it's really interesting to think about yourself and the choices that you have made in your life. I mean, this is where I ended up myself, is wondering, like, why do I live in the places I live? And what is it that informed these places? And how do I feel about them? And how does my family of origin feel about them? And to what extent did I get to choose these places? And what went into these decisions? Was there family pressure? I live in a house that is 10 minutes away from the house that I grew up in. And in some ways, I feel like that was a choice that I made of my own free will. In some ways, I feel like that was sort of preordained because of birth order and because of my family. And it was so interesting to think about the ways that we are free to choose certain things, and we are free to define ourselves in a certain way, whether that's our language, or our dress, or the places we go, or the books that we read, or what we put on our bookshelves. I mean, all of these things are ways that we define ourselves. And so the idea of this home, both in terms of the two of them and themselves, but also, so the idea of this home becomes very defining for her. So I loved this book, and I'm going to leave it there. Maybe you can spend a little time thinking about the choices that you've made and these sort of anthropological concepts and the different ways that you prioritize things and the different ways that you see yourself or see the people around you. I found this book so interesting, and there's so much more that we could talk about, but I'm going to leave it there. I hope that this deep dive, if you haven't read the book yet, is going to really add to your reading experience. And if you have already read the book, I hope it's allowed you to understand it a little bit more deeply. So thank you for tuning in, and if you need an escape, head right back to the Fox page and find something else to listen to. Happy reading!